One, two, three, four. Sha la 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 la, live for today. Sha la 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 la, live for today.
So I guess we are lab partners, hee hee hee.
Yeah. What should we talk about while we are performing our laboratory experiment?
We do not have much in common. Do we?
No.
LOL. Well, tell me about yourself.
Well, I consider myself a punk. I like music, clothing, and art that is not mainstream.
Yuck. I like Britney Spears and Justin Bieber.
Gross.
Mainstream music, clothing, and art is better because it is not weird.
The counterculture movement has been around longer than Bieber fever. Plus, counterculture allows for free expression. Just look at the 1960s.
What is counterculture and what happened in the 60s?
Here, check out this rad video on American counterculture.
Counterculture originated in France. It first emerged in middle-class youth in Paris. They were opposing the strict work ethic of the Industrial Revolution.
The bohemianism that began in France spread to America and persisted through the 1960s, where it reached its peak. The success of counterculture in the 1960s was a direct result of the 1950s Beat generation.
The Beat generation set the groundwork for the 60s hippie movement. Beatniks were opposed to materialism and conformity.
The Beatniks of the 50s slowly transitioned to the hippies of the 60s. The hippies were a collection of individuals who were known for their unconventional values, behaviors, and tastes in fashion, music, and the arts. The hippies believed in voluntary poverty, sexual experimentation, altered states of consciousness through drug use, and opposition to violence. Hippies sought simpler ways of life, adopting Eastern religions and Native American styles. They were never defined by leaders.
Some examples of the 1960s counterculture included folk music by artists like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. Also, psychedelic rock by bands like Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, The Doors, and Jimi Hendrix was followed by the hippies. The indie rock music scene became a staple of hippie counterculture through its rejection of major label rock and roll.
The hippie movement was made possible by the prosperous economy of the 1960s. They also grew in opposition of the war in Vietnam, which was occurring at the time. Despite popular belief that the hippies dominated the youth culture, the majority of American youth in the 60s still belonged to the mainstream pop culture.
60s mainstream culture also blossomed from the prosperous economy. The culture was very consumer-driven, and American youth experienced many fads in music, clothing, and dancing.
Mainstream music was defined by the top singles on the charts at the time. Artists such as Chubby Checker with The Twist, Little Eva with The Locomotion, and the Archies with Sugar Sugar were popular and common on mainstream radios. The very famous and influential British Invasion, with the Beatles emerging in the music scene, defined this mainstream pop culture as well.
Mainstream culture extended into popular movies, television, and fashion fads. The Teen and 20 Record Club, for example, was originally booked for only 6 shows, but extended indefinitely because of its immediate popularity. Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and The Lawrence Welk Show dominated the TV popularity, and beach movies infiltrated mainstream cinema. Fashion trends like patterns and bright colors with fitted styling made from synthetic fabrics became popular as well.
A culture composed completely of fads was not bound to persist throughout the decades to follow. The 1960s mainstream culture died with the arrival of the 1970s and its stagnant economy. Although the hippies decreased in size with the arrival of the 70s, its ideals continued throughout the future. While pop culture always changes according to the decade, a counterculture movement sharing the ideas of the hippies has existed in every decade.
If you look at the 1960s mainstream culture with its innocent trends and look at today's mainstream culture with its emphasis on sex and violence, you can see that they are vastly different. However, if you look at the hippies and today's counterculture with its hipsters, they are very similar.
On the opposite side of the spectrum, it can be debated that mainstream culture has been more influential, as it can be seen on a larger scale and more prevalent to each particular decade. The counterculture has always been on a smaller section of society, not drawing the majority of followers. However, counterculture ideals have persisted longer than 1960s mainstream ideals.
So now it's up to you to decide which is more influential. Something that is smaller but affects multiple generations, or something that is larger and affects only one generation.